The third perspective that we have this evening is from Michael Goodhart. Michael's professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Political Science there. And I think from our workshop last week, I think it's fair to say that brings a slightly different perspective around particularly the relationship between the state and globalisation. But we'll hear a little bit from Michael, no doubt, about that. He has done a lot of work and focused his work on human rights and globalisation in particular, and the interplay between those two elements and forces with the emerging democratic practices. So, Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Anna, also for bringing me out to Australia for an interesting week and a half of workshops and encounters like this one. I'm going to try to touch on all of the questions that Eric outlined at the beginning, following Martin, not in the order that he outlined them. And I'm going to do so by way of telling a story about my own take on a certain set of recent events that Peg's presentation actually set up nicely. And you'll hear about that in just a minute. I will say that this will be as much a partisan analysis in some sense as it will be an analysis anchored in my perspective as a political scientist, but for me those things are difficult to ultimately keep apart, as I think will become clear enough. So, only 15 minutes, so enough with introductions. I'll start with the question whether representative democracy is past its use-by date. And I want to consider this question in light of recent manifestations of civil disobedience, we might say. I would call them uprisings. In places like Indonesia, Spain, Greece, Chile, Mexico, the United States, Canada, Israel, Brazil, and interestingly, for my purposes, maybe Turkey, depending on how we want to think about what's been happening in Turkey lately, but that's a tougher case. All of these uprisings have occurred in established democracies of newer or slightly older vintage. And they're, in some respects, like eruptions or solar flares. That is, to date, they've been bright, hot, and brief. But all of them have in common, I think, a dissatisfaction with the functioning of representative democracy. Not just the policies that are being generated by specific democracies, although that's certainly part of it in the case of each of these uprisings, but also with the system itself, which in all cases the protesters in these movements find unresponsive, out of touch, and beholden to corporate and financial interests. Now, the timing and the rough simultaneity of these uprisings across a range of established democracies and what we typically think of as both the developed and the developing worlds is not a coincidence. Again, like eruptions or solar flares, there's something seething beneath the surface here. And I think the key to understanding what's going on is the global financial crisis of 2008 and following. The GFC made the failures of democracy, of representative democracy as it's currently functioning, I think, quite evident. Banks and corporations who caused the crisis were bailed out by governments. Citizens and states got bankruptcy, austerity, and increased taxes to pay for the bailouts of the banks and the corporations that caused the crisis. Now, I think these were the triggers of these uprisings, although each one, of course, had many local and contextual factors that helped to explain them. But their point is quite similar, and that is that representative democracy has been in some sense corrupted, perverted, delegitimized. And this is related, I think, to the important question about whether too much inequality can subvert democracy. The answer is yes. But it's not only or mainly inequality that I think is at issue, at least for the people who participated in these movements. Rather, it's neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, in this context, takes a couple of forms. First, there's the direct influence that corporations and financial interests have on public policy. We're all pretty familiar with how this works. But there's also been 30 plus years of so-called market reform that have created a situation in which there's a threat of capital flight if governments dare to tax or regulate the economy in ways that what we used to in an old-fashioned era call capital dislike. Now, this introduces what's sometimes referred to approvingly by economists as a kind of market discipline that limits what the state can do. And this has translated quite straightforwardly, as all of the protesters in these various movements have complained in one sense and another, the dismantling of what is public. That is, the sort of systematic disassemblement of the public things that the democratic state provided during its apogee in the middle of the 20th century. Now, this is what the uprisings are all about. Inequality is one important aspect of it, but it's related to these underlying causes, these broader causes, I believe, connected with neoliberalism. Now, I think, and here I speak sort of loosely empirically, that is to say, this is an impression based on the few empirical studies that I've read. I haven't directly done this research myself. But many of the people taking part in these uprisings, if you will, see representative democracy as beyond reform or rejuvenation from within. That is to say, in some sense, they see themselves as counter-systemic or extra-systemic movements. But I don't think that the point in most cases, although this is not true, certainly there are anarchists involved in these uprisings and what have you, but I think for most people at least, the point is not to abolish representative democracy. I think the point rather is to force it to reform itself by bringing pressure from the outside. This is, I think, precisely the kind of civil disobedience tradition that Peg is talking about. These people don't reject the legitimacy of the state. They just think that the state is the one that's compromised its legitimacy in this equation precisely by prostituting itself to the interests of the banks and capital and what have you. So, this gets us to the question of the role of social movements and their role in sustaining democracy, providing education, and so on. And actually, perhaps disappointingly to Eric, who in his introduction said I might have something to say about the globalization stuff, this is as close as I'm going to come to touching on that question directly, but I will touch on it. And also, for full disclosure, I'm going to refer here to the Occupy movement, and I should say that I had some small bit to do with the Occupy movement in Pittsburgh, and so I'll be speaking in part from that experience, but I don't want to sort of disguise that in any kind of way. I think that most of these uprisings have not yet coalesced into social movements as social scientists typically understand them. About Occupy, it's commonly said, it was a moment, not a movement. And I think there's something to that. But nonetheless, I think that they are key because they create pressure for reform, because they aim to not make policy directly, but steer policy back in a direction more consistent with what I think democracy has historically stood for. And they're explicitly anti-neoliberal in their orientation. This is a very common theme, again, across all of these different movements in different countries. And importantly, they are what's known in the literature as prefigurative movements. That is to say, they try in their conduct to prefigure the kind of society that they advocate. Now, this is with greater and lesser degrees of success, but I will say, importantly, that the spaces created by the Occupy movement, the actual encampments, were amazing democratic spaces, not just in terms of fostering debate and deliberation, but also in terms of providing the kinds of social services that the state increasingly has retreated from providing. So at Occupy Pittsburgh, for instance, we fed people, we provided medical care to people, and not just people who were living in the camps, but people who might come down to the camps, because as I'm sure you know, in America, one does not have a right to health care. And despite what you might think about what you've heard from Obamacare, one's not going to have a right to health care in the future either. One's just going to have the right to purchase health care. Anyway, that's not your problem, that's our problem. And I think it's important to see the power of movements of this kind, right? One of the raps on Occupy was, well, it didn't achieve anything. It didn't know what it's about. But I think that's a huge mistake. Occupy created political space, And it began to change the discourse in such a way that it became possible to talk about inequality in America again. This had simply not been possible mostly in my entire lifetime. I mean, I heard something about inequality in the 70s when I was 5 years old or something and didn't really have a good grasp of what was going on. But post 1980, discussion of inequality in America, to the extent that it happened at all, was conducted around the inequalities that the sort of state imposed on firms by daring to tax or regulate them, or the kind of inequality created by so-called reverse discrimination, allegedly created by affirmative action programs and so on. I mean, this was an incredibly impoverished discourse of inequality, been completely transformed thanks to the Occupy movements. But this is also a global effort. These social movements are not simply unique occurrences in different countries, but there is coordination. Some of you may be familiar with the World Social Forum and the processes that happen around that. This is a forum, a global space for facilitation, cooperation, coordination, and the promotion of solidarity across these kind of anti-neoliberal, or sometimes they're called anti-globalization movements. One of the slogans, "Another globalization is possible," sort of captures this. And it captures, I think, the idea both that there's a global phenomenon that needs to be addressed and that this has to be addressed locally in specific contexts by different movements. Another phrase that I quite like, the title of a book by a guy called Paul Kingsnorth, which I recommend if you're interested in a history of the global justice movement, is called "One No, Many Yeses." The idea being what unites these movements is their shared saying no to a certain form of globalization, but the many yeses represent the many different things that they stand for. So these movements are still embryonic, especially at the transnational level, but they're related, I think, to these mass protests that I started off by referring to, and they trace back to the early history of anti-globalization protests in Seattle and Genoa, Washington, and other places. Now, I think this kind of transnational coordination is ultimately going to be very important, and that's partly because neoliberalism is itself a well-coordinated transnational political project, and so it needs to be opposed, at least in part, on that level. This brings me to the question of direct democracy, where I'm going to mostly agree with what's been said. On the critical side, if you have in mind images of citizens in the Athenian assembly or gathered under Rousseau's oak tree making law together or something, forget about it. I think as California and Switzerland illustrate, Martin talked about the problems with referenda. I completely agree. These are often vulnerable to precisely the same kinds of corrupting influences that representative democracy itself has fallen prey to. I do want to stress, however, that I think citizen participation is of the utmost importance. And here I would draw a distinction between direct citizen rule, as often envisioned in the notion of direct democracy, and what political scientists at least are increasingly referring to as participatory governance, or sometimes co-governance. And what this idea means is getting the citizens involved with bureaucrats and with elected officials in the actual process of governing. And there's all kinds of examples of this that have been well studied. Participatory budgeting in Brazil, the use of citizen policy councils, the use of citizen juries to help decide important kinds of policy questions and disputes, and a whole range of others that I'd be happy to talk more about later on. The point is that when these things are well designed and well implemented, they help to increase accountability, they help to increase the responsiveness of governance, and governance, and they help to promote ownership of policies and of government among the citizens. Now, I'm not meaning to suggest that participatory governance is the answer to the challenges facing representative democracy, but I think it's part of the answer. So far, however, and this I think is an important challenge ahead, reforms of this kind have not been taken up, at least in any broad way, by the protesters involved in the movements that I started out as describing earlier. For many of them, to work within the system, as I mentioned earlier, seems futile, seems hopeless, seems like selling out. I think finding a way to bridge that gap, to find ways to sort of reinvigorate and rejuvenate democracy from within through important kinds of institutional innovations, and not just through new rhetoric or something, is crucially important. This brings me to an important point, I think. One key question is how traditional political actors and here I mean politicians, but also parties, trade unions, and others, are going to react to these kinds of uprisings and to the kinds of reforms that are needed. Again, in connection with Occupy, the political parties didn't know what to do. Or I should say, the Democratic Party didn't. The Republicans knew what to do. These people were traitors, they were, rabble, whatever. That was easy for them. The Democratic Party, that's the nominally left party, the only slightly right of center party, as opposed to radically right of center in the American context. The Democrats didn't quite know what to do with this thing, partly because it wasn't something that they thought they could easily control. Some politicians sort of endorsed it. That was mostly a local thing at the national level. They took up the discourse of inequality without sort of making reference to Occupy, which they were pretty suspicious of. Same thing with the trade unions. They didn't know quite what to do. I should say in Pittsburgh they were quite good, but Pittsburgh is a city with a long tradition of unionism, a city where trade unions have long been active in democratic politics. We met often in the Steelworkers Hall. They bought us pizza and beer, which I thought was a very democratic gesture. So that cooperation was there, but it was fraught. And this is, I think, in part because trade unions have been systemic actors, right? They have their politicians, they participate in party politics, and so in a certain sense they are implicated in some of these critiques of representative democracy. So how these actors react going forward, I think, will be an interesting question. In Europe, of course, the situation is a little bit different. The traditional parties here have rallied around one another in opposition to the protesters. Take the case of Greece, where the New Democrats and the Socialists formed a coalition government to keep Syriza out of power because Syriza dared float the idea of Keynesian policies and a possible withdrawal from the euro, which would have forced the German banks rather than the Greek taxpayers to foot the bill for the bad investments made by the German banks. Italy is another example. We could talk more about the reasons why these parties are rallying to defend neoliberal policies the last 30 years, but I'm starting to run out of time. I think it's important to stress this, though, because as the parties rally to protect the system, they not only thwart the will of the people, to use another old-fashioned notion, but they open the door, I think, to right-wing extremism. And we've seen lots of examples of this all around Europe as austerity really takes hold, right? If you don't recognize the legitimacy of people protesting in a tradition of civil disobedience of the kind that Peg was outlining, you're forcing them into less desirable and much more ultimately threatening forms of protest and political activity, I worry. So just to conclude here, I want to say we can't do without representative democracy. It's vital to accountability and to control. It's vital to aligning the purposes of government with the protection of citizens' rights, welfare, and interest. And when I say this, I'm not just giving my opinion. These are empirically well-established facts. We know that democracies do best at doing all of these things, despite their many problems. But I think representative democracy urgently needs reinvention and reinvigoration. And I think that the role that social movements and anti-systemic uprisings will ultimately play here is one of the key variables to follow, along with, as I mentioned, the reaction of traditional political actors. I think that these uprisings are incredibly important and timely, but I think it's a very open question how they'll turn out. And so that, I think, is one of the questions that all of us have to pay close attention to. Thank you.